Welcome to Podcast Pediatricians, episode 2.
Actually, Matt, that's episode, I wrote it down, 002. So we have 997 more episodes before we run out of numbers.
Okay, so much for the incidentals there. I am Matt Gotthold.
And I am Rob Walter.
And this is an episode about sleep, and we'll launch into that in a second.
Part 2.
It is indeed part 2. But just to give you a little bit of understanding of our podcast, each week we plan to highlight one particular pediatric topic, sometimes in multiple parts, and sometimes with a follow-up with an expert in the field. This is our second episode on pediatric sleep. Our episodes, our podcast, in fact, is done from the standpoint, from the point of view of two community pediatricians, and we are in the trenches, so we are not going to pull punches on our opinions.
And our disclaimer, we are sharing our own personal opinions of pediatric care. Always talk to your own pediatric caregiver about your child. Pediatric caregivers should always consult expert guidelines and consider their own community's standards of care.
And we ask that you check out our website, podcastpediatricians.com. That's P-O-D-C-A-S-T, pediatricians.com, to check on show notes, share your pearls, and maybe even an embarrassing faux pas. And we thought we'd start this episode, indeed, with one of Rob's multitude of embarrassing faux pas. Hit it, Rob.
Well, it wasn't hard. Also, just want to mention that this is our second episode, and we're both on call here on the weekend and interrupted by multiple phone calls. So if you hear some bad splicing, it's because we got a call in the middle of this. So faux pas. It says on the website, share your embarrassing faux pas and share your pearls. And I think Matt's going to follow up this with one of his pearls. But I thought I'll go ahead and jump right in and talk about one of my many embarrassing moments. My first year in pediatric practice, I'd been in academics and went back to pediatric practice. I love Halloween. I thought, okay, I'll get some masks. And I had this friendly kind of happy mask for the little kids and this really, really scary slasher movie Halloween Jason type mask for the older kids. I look at the chart, look at the paper chart in the door. I miss those paper charts in the door. I know Matt likes EMR, but I really miss those paper charts. So I look at the chart, see the age, and I pop in. I get through the whole day, and people think I thought they thought it was funny. I was enjoying myself. One of the last charts, 17-year-old, put on this incredibly scary mask. I run in the room with a big growl to see a 17-year-old boy with autism and severe anxiety who had a particular phobia of monsters. Now, I think probably they could hear – it's terrible. I think they could have heard his screams in neighboring Pennsylvania.
They probably still are hearing his
I was
screams.
Mortified. I was ashamed. Needless to say, the visit had to be totally canceled. I still do this on Halloween, but I am a lot more careful and learn my lessons. I've got lots of them, but that's my first faux pas in pediatrics. Matt, give us a pearl.
Oh, my goodness. So as Rob said, we're trying to accumulate both faux pas and pearls from the pediatric community, and for that matter, even from parents who happen to be listeners, because we do encourage savvy parents to listen to our podcast. So I'm going to share a pearl that I think I swiped out of one of the contemporary peds magazines or something along that lines. So here in Delaware, we consider ourselves to be right in the middle of Lyme disease central. We see it all the time. When we studied at the local children's hospital, it was something that was drilled into our head in terms of the appropriateness of the workup, etc. So we spend an awful lot of time speaking with parents about how to remove ticks when they give us a call or when we see the tick in the office attached to a child. So one particularly I guess innocuous means of removing a tick that seems to really work quite well, as opposed to the squeeze the tick at the base and potentially squirt the head guts into the child's bloodstream.
Love the head guts. Love
Head
the
guts,
Borrelia
yeah.
burgorferi head guts. I have a T-shirt that says that.
Yeah. But anyway, so the way that this is done is one takes a gauze. It can be any size. I personally prefer 2x2s, and you essentially put it over the tick with the tick in the midst of it, and then you essentially go through the circular motion of kind of a wax on, wax off type of thing, and it really will just kind of unscrew the tick from the child.
So like a karate kid.
Yeah,
wax
that kind of
on,
thing. Wax on, wax off. So just in a
Mr.
circular
Miyagi.
motion.
Okay.
And because the gauze is tacky enough, typically the tick sticks pretty nicely to it as you're starting to do the circular motion, and out it comes pretty innocuously and in toto, by the way.
I've never tried that, so I will try that. I will say, both Matt and I, since we're in Lyme Central, we were part of when we used to give Lyme vaccine to kids. We were one of the first places. And right now, you can give Lyme vaccine for your dogs, but you can't give it to your kids because when the vaccine came out, it was a combination, I think, if it didn't make enough money, and there was some questions about arthritis in older people, I think, along the Blue Route. And so it was withdrawn, and it'll never come back. So it's sad for us in the high-risk area that we can't get the vaccine for our children.
Yeah, the Blue Route, by the way, is a nearby.
You don't have to
highway.
explain it; they can Google
Come
that.
on, okay, all right. It's a nearby highway where lots of wealthy people live.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right, we are going to be right back. And as promised last episode, Matt's going to give us a little bit of his historical research background on sleep, and we'll go more into clinical sleep in kids. Okay, welcome back to Podcast Pediatricians, and don't forget podcastpediatricians.com. And as promised, here is Dr. Matt on history of sleep.
Okay, so actually I'm going to start out by going through a few things that kind of lead into the history of sleep, just exploring sleep in general in terms of what it is. What's sleep? What happens during sleep? Why do we need it? And then we'll go into a little bit of history of sleep. And then once we cover these basics, then we'll get more specifically into the sleep of various ages, infants, toddlers, children, adolescents. So it's, as a human being, it's kind of easy to assume that we all know what sleep is, since we all do it, hopefully on a daily basis at least. But to look a little bit more closely, it isn't always as straightforward as it would seem. It's kind of hard to define. It's difficult to get a good sense of what the sleep experience is. Indeed, one author I was reading pointed out it's like trying to ponder experience of being born or of dying. It's one of those things that really is tough to discern. It's largely unavailable to us. But for some definitions, I figured we'd turn to some experts. So few are as expert as a gentleman by the name of William Dement. He's an MD, PhD out of Stanford, and he's a pioneer in sleep research. In his book, which is called The Promise of Sleep, actually he's written numerous books, but in this book at least, he starts by trying to define sleep as having two key features. So the first is that sleep constructs a virtual wall between the conscious mind and the outside world. So it's kind of an entirely different form of consciousness. And then second, sleep's immediately reversible. So even when somebody's in a deep sleep, a consistent or an intense stimulation can usually wake that sleeper, or can always wake that sleeper. And if for some reason they can't be awoken, as Dr. Dement points out, then that means they're actually not asleep and they're either unconscious or dead. So,
to review, if you can't wake someone up, they're unconscious, in a coma, or dead.
Or
Thank
dead.
You, Matt.
Yes,
okay.
yeah.
Good.
So I think that's pretty straightforward. The other two things that Dr. Dement had added as other observations of sleep is that it, number one, occurs naturally, and then number two, also occurs periodically. So we all need to experience this from time to time. Again, hopefully at least on a daily basis. But when we break it down from a more technical standpoint, there are an awful lot of changes that go on in the brain. These are physiologic, these are electrical, and they can be analyzed by EEG, which we have opted not to get into on this episode. It's a little deep for us, and really we hope that you'll come back and listen to us on other episodes. So we didn't want to get quite that thick in the weeds yet. But one thing that did seem to like it was a pertinent thing to discuss is the there are actually 4 theories on why we sleep. Why do we need to sleep? Why do we need to sleep, Rob? You don't know. That's why I'm going to tell you.
I need to sleep more.
All right.
But
so there are actually 4 different theories that are put forth by the experts in this field. And the first of which is something called the inactivity theory. So this has also been known in the literature as the adaptive theory or the evolutionary theory. And what this talks about is the fact that decreased activity at night, at least in the past, as we as humans were becoming the humans we are today. This served to keep us both safe and out of harm's way when it got dark outside, and we were particularly more vulnerable to the threats, mostly being predators at that time. Helped us to avoid having accidents, doing activities at nighttime, and at least theoretically, by natural selection, this behavior evolved to become what we now call sleep. The second of these theories, of these four theories, is that this is all about conserving energy. That it's not always obvious to those of us who live in a world where there seems to be plenty of things here in Western civilization. But at one point, food resources were not as abundant as they are. And one of the strongest factors in natural selection is competition for essentially energy resources. So the energy conservation theory puts forth that the primary function of sleep is to reduce energy needs and use during the night, especially at a time when it's least optimal to go out and search for food or to hunt.
Now, I could go with that theory because human beings, the amount of energy humans use in their brain is way more than other primates, and so it takes a lot of resources. As we learned when we did our book, Sapiens.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that someday. But that first part about the inactivity theory, that it's safer if you're not active, I mean, in evolution, if you are awake all the time, you're probably not going to get eaten by that lion as much as if you're sleeping all the time. So I can't really go with that part.
I see your point.
I think it's safer not to be asleep if you're in the jungle.
Or adapt, like, I don't know, aren't there some animals who only sleep for like 5 minutes at a pop?
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't know what they are, but, it's beyond the scope of this podcast.
Yes.
The third theory on this is called the restorative theory. So this is another explanation for why we sleep. In essence, says that we sleep to restore what we lose while we're awake. Sleep provides the opportunity for the body to repair and rejuvenate itself. So this has actually gained a little bit of traction in studies. One of the most interesting findings in a lot of studies that have been done on sleep and sleep deprivation is that if an animal is completely sleep deprived, they tend to lose their immune function and eventually will die in a matter of weeks. This is also supported by scientific findings that many of the critical restorative functions of the body, things like tissue repair and muscle growth and protein synthesis, a lot of these things happen for the most part, or at least even in some cases exclusively, while we sleep. So seems to be some validity to this theory, at least.
I agree. You asked me in the beginning, why do we sleep? And I think we sleep because we don't want to die. Because without sleep, we'll die. So, yeah, I go with that theory.
All right. And then the final theory is called the brain plasticity theory. So this is a pretty compelling explanation for why we sleep also, and there are certainly some research that would back this up. So this explains that the reason that we sleep is correlated to changes in the structure and the organization of our brains. Structural building, remodeling, that's what is really the definition of brain plasticity. It's not completely understood, but it would seem that there's a relationship to sleep that has multiple very important implications here. For instance, it has really become abundantly clear that sleep plays a big role in the brain development in babies and in children, and even in adults. There is seems to be a really clear and valid relationship between sleep and brain plasticity. And this has been demonstrated time and time again in studies that will induce sleep deprivation, and that then leads to people not being able to perform nearly as well as they otherwise would in a variety of tasks.
Like Matt and I being on call, post-call, up during the night.
Yeah, we're not exactly at our sharpest. And although we're from the
sharp
generation where we used to work like 185 hours a week,
yeah.
And now these wimpy residents put in a mere, what is it, Rob, 80 hours a week? Something like that.
Yeah,
some ridiculously minuscule number of hours.
Yes, but there's probably a lot less.
When men were men.
That's a more complicated. Actually, in pediatrics, it's when women
were
women.
There's
no men left in pediatrics anymore.
Not many.
Nope.
Not many. So moving right along, what we're going to do next is hopefully quickly and mercifully, sorry, not mercilessly, although you may feel otherwise, move into some history. So before we consider how sleep affects children, which is going to be the bulk of our point here over the next episode or so, it makes decent sense to explore the question of how did we get to our current understanding of sleep and the concepts that surround it. So let's give this some context. The way we think of sleep in the 21st century, at least in our culture, is much different than the way it was thought of in the past. How we feel about sleep has gone through a number of dramatic changes over the centuries. So as we know it, it's played a major role in almost every religious and spiritual tradition. It was seen as a connection to the divine world and its inhabitants, and for some cultures, even a means of transcendence, from our existence on a day-to-day basis. The Greeks, the Egyptians, both had strong beliefs and strong cultural venues for expressing the importance of dreams. Both these cultures had sleep temples. And the sleep temples were a means by which one could go to sleep and then, after one woke up, have their dreams interpreted by the various priests and oracles.
And Joseph in his Technicolor Dreamcoat?
Yes,
like
Joseph.
I remember.
Yeah, I knew you were going to bring Broadway into this somehow. Yeah, and Joseph certainly was a big part of the history of Broadway. The Greeks and the Romans also went so far as to involve specific gods that were considered to be the sleep gods, and so in Greece there was Hypnos. See our current use of the word hypnotic, etc., and also Somnus for the Romans, like somnolent, which I'm sure I'm flirting with making you at this point. But these cultures both considered sleep to be a kind of a middle state between life and death. In ancient Greece, what they seemed to be also interested in was what exactly happened when one fell asleep. So the Greeks believed that your blood retreated into the interior of your body, including your brain, from the surface of your body, and that when we woke up, it diffused back out again or resurfaced again. Even Hippocrates had specific beliefs that were kind of akin to this. He believed that the blood literally moved from your limbs into your abdomen to warm itself up, and this also produced sleep. Okay, so moving right along into the pre-industrial era.
Wait, we're the pre-industrial era?
Pre-industrial.
What about I thought the ancient history. What about the Punic Wars? I was all excited.
Well, we're not going to cover all
history. Persia, the Battle of Thermopylae.
We're not going to cover all of ancient history. Come on, man.
Well, another time.
We have to move this right along.
I was kind of psyched for some of those wars. Okay.
Well,
pre-industrial sleep.
Let's talk about pre-industrial sleep. So this differs from the way we sleep presently, not just because it seemed to be more revered, but even in terms of its essence, its nature. In most cultures, sleep wasn't the typical uninterrupted period of time that we experience now. In fact, throughout most of history, the night was divided into two separate periods of sleep. There was a first sleep and a second sleep. This is even mentioned as far back as Homer's Odyssey. So between the two sleep stages, there was a period of time when people were actually awake that could last for even up to a couple hours or so. The people of that time, which was really any time before the pre-industrial period, experienced their sleep this way. It was considered to be a very valuable time to people. In fact, Roger Urquhart, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, who authored At the Close of the Day, a book on sleep, describes this time between sleep as being, quote, fires needed to be tended, a tub of ale needed to be brewed. Still, most people never left their bed, preferring instead to ponder dreams from which they awakened. No other interval afforded such a secluded period of darkness in which to absorb fresh visions of solace, spirituality, and self-revelation. It was also a time for prayer, and it was also a time for making babies.
That's Matt's euphemism for sex.
So sleep has also been a part of the world's major religions. David hung a harp above his head so that when the night wind blew across its strings, it would wake him to sing the Psalms. Jesus rose to pray on a hillside in the hours just before dawn. Muhammad slept half the night and rose to pray for a third of the night and then slept for the remaining sixth. Even the Buddha meditated at night. According to the sutras, he became the awakened one between the hours of the ox and the tiger. That is between 2 and 4 a.m., which would seem to be correlating with that middle space between first and second sleep.
But not having sex.
So in studies that have been conducted at the NIH over just the last couple decades or so, when subjects were deprived of artificial light after dusk, what ended up happening over a period of weeks was that indeed people fell into this type of a sleep cycle. They fell asleep at night, and then they started to wake up a little after midnight, lie awake for a couple hours, and then drift back to sleep again, which is really fascinating. One wonders whether that indeed is just our natural state.
Or these days we'd call it insomnia and sleeping disorders.
That's for you, man.
When you wake up, you can't back to sleep. But back then, when it was dark and there wasn't light, it was a natural thing.
They're usually sleeping with barn animals and whatnot. So, yeah, and in fact, sleeping in private quarters was really part of the way that the people of Europe and the European nation states considered themselves to be more civilized than other societies, or even the people in their country who were of lower classes. So during the medieval times, sleeping naked or in public was not considered to be a real big deal. But with the idea of sharing a bed with people outside of one's family, that was really considered to be just a very typical way of life. As that became, because of the beliefs of the upper classes, as that started to become more embarrassing, it eventually became unusual for even people within a family to sleep together, which is the way an awful lot of people existed. Family members had their own beds and then eventually had their own bedrooms.
Which kind of gets back to now the movement of having the family bed. And first episode, I kind of made fun of Blossom. Mm-hmm. You made fun of me for using the word Blossom, but the family bed and attaching parenting. And while that may not something I'm promoting, there is an argument about that is a more natural way and what humans were probably more meant to do than our modern society.
Yeah, in fact, it's really, from at least the reading I've done, it's really only those of us in parts of the West, including U.S., including Canada and the U.K. and Germany, who sleep the way we sleep, in separate beds for the most part. That largely, the vast majority of the world sleeps as a family and largely in the same bed. So, yeah, although the AAP has held this up as a real safety issue, it would seem that the rest of the world seems to have no problem with it, and it goes beyond just comfort. It goes right to kind of the core of many cultures. So this is something that at least is worth thinking about, not because we're proposing it, because we're not, but just understanding the way that it had come to into existence.
All right, now you're getting to it, Matt. What destroyed the whole system?
Yeah, so here's what
got us out of the us out of the family bed.
That nice kind of pastoral existence got blown apart by artificial light. So by the end of the 17th century, artificial light had come into play, and at least 50 cities across Europe were lit up at nighttime. And then by the dawn of the 20th century, it had gotten to the extent where Paris alone had more than 50,000 gas street lamps.
Which is incredible to think in the early 1900s, they had 50,000.
50? Well, Paris is a big city, right?
Yeah.
So that was one piece of it. So the Industrial Revolution definitely brought about huge changes in the way that we sleep and our relationship to sleep. Artificial light allowed the night to be tamed. And then mechanization let it be monetized. So as Arianna Huffington pointed out in her book, Sleep Revolution, which is actually quite good. She states it as capitalism had no use for sleep. So sleep became not just considered to lack value, but in a lot of corners of society, it started to be mocked and be scorned. Each hour spent sleeping was another hour spent not producing, and therefore was considered to be wasted. So sleep was actually made to conform to the mindset of this new economic order. Going without sleep, eventually, and this still seems to sound true in our society, going without sleep was seen as an act of masculinity. It was, strong people didn't have to sleep. Sleep became a sign of unmanly weakness, and this kind of idea really still lingers on today.
Like as Matt was talking about medical training, like when I was a resident back 80 million years ago, we were on call every night, and we were totally miserable.
And this is kind of a little bit timely, because some of the major capitalists at that time, people like Thomas Edison, really found no use for sleep. In fact, at one point, Edison had predicted that by multiple hundreds of years down the road, we human beings wouldn't need it at all, because it seemed to be a true waste of time. And even our new president, Donald Trump, has pointed out his own lack of sleep is really a strength and as part of his success.
But I really would like him to get more sleep.
Yeah, I think
he needs to get as much
most powerful
sleep
man in the world needs some sleep.
I really do.
Yeah. So considering all this, it's not a big surprise that maximizing work and minimizing sleep, it has become really a part of our consciousness, at least here in America. It seems to be one of our foundations. So the problem that this kind of a mindset brings about is that we have really started to become a culture that sees sleep as more of a hindrance than a help. So in popular culture, the achievements that we're used to seeing amplified as a great narrative really seems to be, for us these days, a bit of a stumbling block. So artificial light really changed the whole scope of our sense of sleep. But in addition to that, there have been a variety of other things that have really come to play major roles in our sleep or lack thereof. One of which is universal education. The fact that school needs to start at a certain time, at least that's the way our culture has perceived it.
Kids need to study till like midnight in high school now.
At least apparently. Yeah. Various substances have changed history. The spread of opium, the later use of broad and seemingly endless use of caffeine these days.
That they're selling in high schools now.
Yes.
We'll get to that later.
Yeah. Changes in diet. Changes in the way we travel. Most particularly seeming to be topical these days is the use of electronics and our electronic media.
Snapchat.
So all these things really come together to make our sleep experience vastly different than the way it was in the pre-industrial era. In fact, one of the things that I think really seems to tie all this together was something that I read that was ascribed to Eve Fairbanks. She was an author who had written in the New Yorker. And what she talked about was really the way we've become so anxious about sleep. And what she had said was, quote, "We want to sleep more now, not because we value sleep more on its own terms, but because we're so fixated on productivity. Instead of being a strange, wild, mysterious land of nod whose purpose we don't fully understand, sleep has been colonized by our ambition, becoming just another zone of the day to be farmed for its productivity."
Amen.
Jeez, that's powerful stuff.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to Podcast Pediatricians. So, as we talked about last episode, we are not looking for any sponsors at this point, nor are they probably looking for us. But we decided just to plug things that we like, and they don't necessarily like us, so they're not necessarily endorsing us. So, Matt, you're up.
All right, so I had stumbled across, and I wish I could remember where I had seen this, stumbled across an app called Tiny Cards. And so Tiny Cards is essentially an app that has groups of flashcards in it. And the flashcards are involved in a lot of subjects. Things like countries of South America, parts of the eye, Jurassic dinosaurs.
Symbols from Star Wars.
Symbols from Star Wars was one of them.
Terrible.
Absolutely, yep. And even American leaf identification. So what it does is it presents you with a picture, and then you're supposed to guess, and then you touch the screen, it flips the card over and lets you know what the true answer is. So it's kind of a neat way to learn. So always looking for new things to learn, and this looks like a really neat little, very painless means of doing that.
All right, so check it out, Tiny Cards. And then
Tiny Cards.
Building on last episode when I mentioned blueberries, I'm going to go get a little bit wild and go with sweet potatoes. Okay, sweet potatoes
You're kooky.
is my favorite part of Thanksgiving. Pineapple, melted marshmallows on top. And what I found out last month, this kind of blew my mind, they sell pre-washed sweet potatoes that are pre-shrink wrapped in BPA-free shrink wrap that you can just throw in the microwave for 7-8 minutes, and miraculously you have a sweet potato all ready to eat.
Wow. Couldn't you just wash one off? And
Well, then someone did say to me last week, said, why don't you just buy sweet potatoes and put a lot of fork marks in them and then just wash them off. I'm not sure how much do you have to scrub a sweet potato? It sounds difficult.
And then besides, you'd be missing out on that BPA-free shrink wrap experience.
Right.
Oh, man, Rob.
All right.
But
anyway,
check that out.
Check that out in your Loso Grove. It's fresh. It's fresh foods, and we both support that. All right. We'll be right back.
Okay, so we're going to circle back around to aspects of sleep from a clinical standpoint. And as we've said now multiple times during these podcasts, sleep really does seem to be everything. All roads lead back to sleep in some way, shape, or form.
All right, and we talked about last episode about young infant sleep advice to try to guarantee they'll sleep through the night by 4 to 6 months. Again, those are only for parents whose priority is they sleep through the night. But what about those older infants who just won't sleep through the night? I don't see that as much, I think, because of some sleep hygienes that I talk about. There's many, many books written about getting your baby to sleep and using words like ferberizing your baby.
Yeah, I think any time that you see 100 different books written on a subject is because somebody's looking for an easy out. So some presumed expert will put their own spin on it and create their own system. And of course they'll be happy to take any proceeds from desperate parents.
Right. And, there's, again, I'm going to quote again that Dr. Carroll from Hoosier U. He published an article in the New York Times in this summer, 2016, and he just nicely outlined the 4 most common methods out there. The first one, called the Extinction Method, which is letting baby Joey cry all night, which is pretty tough on mom. I'm being a little sexist, but I have found over the years that it's much tougher for a mom to hear their babies cry all night than it is dads. Mm-hmm. And I do sometimes use this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But it's tough. The second one is graduated extinction, where you let little Joey cry longer and longer each night. First 10 minutes, then 15, then 20, then 30. This isn't my favorite. It seems like you're teaching the baby that if they scream long enough, eventually they'll get what they want. It doesn't make that much sense to me.
Yeah, I have seen it work. I think that overall, what one has to wonder whether if the baby actually has a true sense of time. Oh gee, it's been 15 minutes. Mom's due to come back in here right now. I don't get that aspect of it. I do think to an extent, though, it's desensitizing the baby and deconditioning them. And for some people, this seems to work.
Right. So the third one is called bedtime fading, where you push the bedtime back much later than usual until Joey's just completely exhausted, and you try to put him down a little awake, and then gradually each night you bring the bedtime a little bit earlier. And so you can get him back to having a normal bedtime. Now, I have used this, and I have had some success with this bedtime fading technique. We'll talk about teens in the next episode, but even some of them will have the kids do an all-nighter so they can reset their clock. But have you tried the bedtime fading?
Yeah, although bedtime fading, at least my understanding, which is interesting, is different than yours. My understanding is, essentially the fading of the caregiver. So I know that with at least one of my kids, what we ended up doing was doing the old, okay, I will stay in your room, but I'm not touching you and I'm ignoring you type of thing as I sat by the bed with a book. And after a couple of days, my daughter, settled in, and I moved my chair closer to the door. So I think that, when at least from what I can tell, the texts talk about fading, there seem to be two different
Right, I think there's some overlap. So I absolutely will do that in terms of, I think of that more as weaning the child off of having to have the parent there.
Right.
So they get farther and farther, they don't touch them until they get out the door. But definitely overlap. The last major type is called scheduled awakening, where you wake up Joey on purpose a few minutes before they usually would wake up during the night and try to end their pattern of waking up. Now, I've used this for night terrors. We'll get to that, where they wake up at a certain time, and I have the parents wake them up a little before that. I really haven't had this scheduled awakening for young infants who aren't sleeping, and I do tell parents, never wake a child in the middle of the night who's sleeping, so I really don't use this either.
Right. No, this isn't something that I've ever used, although I have used it, as you alluded to, for night terrors, and with some success.
We outline kind of these 4, and the main thing, and Dr. Carroll mentions it, is that whatever you use of these 4, whatever of the 10,000 books out there you use, trying something is better than trying nothing. So any of them may work for your child. And I think that's the takeaway message, is that, you try one of these things and see if it works. And if it doesn't, try a different one.
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, I always will describe this to parents as being like trying to quit smoking. If it's something that you're dedicated to doing, you set your date. You try to make it a time when it's going to be least stressful for you and your spouse or partner, and then you go ahead and put it into play. And if it doesn't work, it's one of those things, like smoking, hopefully, that you kind of still know you need to do. So you set the next date and you come back to it when you feel like you're ready to.
Right, and also if you have babies who are smoking, like Matt seems to have, you could do both together. Of course, again, even parents who try everything, sometimes it just doesn't work, and that baby has sleep issues. We have families who have like 6 kids, and the first 5 do fine, and then the 6th child, same parents, same approach, just is not a good sleeper. And most of these kids do eventually learn to sleep and don't have pathologic conditions, especially if they're happy and thriving and developing normally. Sometimes they do need referral to sleep or behavior specialists to take a closer look at what's going on. Sometimes you got to look for other organic issues. A lot of these kids also have a lot of daytime napping issues. Speaking of napping, the nighttime sleeping of their baby is more important to my parents and their own sleeping than having a great daytime napping schedule. It's nice to have a daytime schedule, but it's not like those early Dr. Spock days where everything was done at 1 o'clock you do this, at 3 o'clock you do this. It doesn't have to be written in stone. Yeah,
at least once or twice a month a parent will say to me, they sleep wonderfully well overnight, but they really don't nap. And I ask, well, do they seem like they're well rested during the day? And they say, yeah, they're great. And I'm like, well, then don't sweat it. We're really shooting for the nighttime anyway here. It's going to give everybody much more peace.
Exactly. Usually, eventually, there's like a short morning nap, then the early afternoon nap, and then a lot of times there's that early evening nap. But as you start the solids, especially lunch, that post-lunch siesta really becomes the key. And ideally, I tell my parents to try to have the last nap eventually done by 3 or 3:30 and try to fade away that early evening nap. But I got to say that gets tougher for especially 2-income families with daycare. You put the kid in the car at 5:30, 6 o'clock. Oh, yeah. They always fall asleep on the way home.
Yeah, there's an awful lot of orchestrating that kind of would need to be done in order to make things rock solid from the standpoint of the older recommendations that pediatricians used to make. And then these days, for the most part, we really have to find what works for people. Rob alluded to a few minutes ago the fact that sometimes you have to look a little bit deeper. So the things that we've mentioned, really, we haven't touched specifically on things like kids who are developmentally different, kids who may have some underlying type of issue from the standpoint of medical issues, enlarged adenoids, sleep apnea, in some way, shape, or form. Those types of things really are things that we have to look at somewhat separately. Although I did want to touch for just a second on sleep environment. And so oftentimes we take the history of the child's sleep pattern without necessarily taking a history of the child's sleep environment. That gets to everything from how much noise is there, how much light is there, how are the parents getting along. Everything is really has really deep implications. And we as pediatricians, I think, unfortunately, are sometimes guilty of skirting over that stuff that really can be things that matter. And cutting right to our blurb on how to ferberize your baby or how to have them sleep with different strategies.
There are also 2 well-described specific sleep scenarios for older infants that we commonly encounter. There's the trained night criers who are automatically picked up by a parent when they start crying, then rocked to sleep or brought into the parent's bed, which is like hitting the baby lottery or going to Disney World. There's no incentive for these infants to try to settle themselves back to sleep. Then the trained night feeders, who are automatically given milk as soon as they start to cry, night after night. I tell parents to imagine someone feeding them a hot fudge sundae in bed every night at 3 a.m. Why would they ever want to give that up? Eventually, they would be hungry for a hot fudge sundae every night at 3 a.m. At least I would. The first step to retraining older infant night feeders is to offer water instead of milk. They certainly won't like it as much, but it's better for their emerging teeth, and it's a good start to ultimately ending the night feeding habit. We're going to just touch on a few other random sleep rules, and I'm just going to throw these out. Don't lay down with your child until they fall asleep, and Matt alluded to that. It's so tempting, especially if you read them a story, but you'll pay for it later if you routinely do that. As Matt explained, all kids may wake up a little during the night. Even kids who sleep through the night, if you videotape them, they probably do wake up once or twice and then go back to sleep. But if they're falling asleep with a parent next to them and they wake up a few hours later, instead of going back to sleep, they'll also start looking for that parent. For the child, it feels like a couple moments later when they wake up and then mommy or daddy has disappeared. So imagine if your child fell asleep in your bed and then you woke up a moment or two later and your child disappeared. You'd like freak out. It'd be like being in a bad Liam Neeson movie. I knew you'd like the Liam Neeson movie.
I could barely get through the first one, so I didn't see 2, 3, 4, and 5. So yeah, I think that what I always will tell parents is that what you really have to consider is what's termed sleep associations. So your child, when they fall asleep, is going to recognize a certain situation, recognize a certain environment, and when they wake up, as they tend to, as Rob spoke about, anywhere from 5-6 times a night. Oftentimes sleep cycles are anywhere from say 45-50 minutes to an hour plus. But there is some subtle drifting up, subtle waking in between times. And if the child wakes up and they don't find the same situations that they were laid down in, then you're up a creek because they're very unhappy about it.
You need to have a great sleep routine for your baby, at least an hour of a routine that's quiet, no screens or exercise. You try to have a transitional object for a young child over age 1. If you have that transitional object, make sure you have a backup. My child lost his one-of-a-kind only bear on vacation in Virginia, and there was hell to pay.
This is a sad story that's repeated over and over again in our culture. Yeah, Winnie the Pooh, the one that my daughter loved and who Buster Brown, our dog, chewed the nose off of, unfortunately bit the dust somewhere on the Jersey Turnpike when I had to change a tire. No, Rob, it wasn't the mob.
It's in the Pine Barrens of Jersey. Don't go to Jersey.
And Winnie the Pooh, too, just didn't cut the mustard with her.
You could buy a new Winnie the Pooh, but you can't find one that Buster
chewed the nose off
of. Right. Sometimes I also talk to parents that it's particular issues of waking up during the night to take pictures of the family and put them around the crib or around the bed. And maybe if they wake up and see that smiling face, they'll be reassured and go back to bed. I have no idea if it helps, but it's something to say to try to help parents.
It seems
like
nothing
nothing
else
to give them.
Mm-hmm.
It does. Another question I get a lot is, when should the child go from the crib to a child bed? And over the years, my answer becomes more and more,
when they can buy their own beer.
Or as late as humanly possible. Because once they're out of that crib, they'll never go back into that crib.
No.
So put the mattress level as low as possible in the crib. And when they're climbing out like Spider-Man, or I would say Ant-Man, then you need to get a regular bed, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Yes, yeah. I tell parents, golly, for as long as you can keep them in there, if they're happy, super. Let them stay in there. It's like their own little private domain.
I'm going to go over a few specific sleep issues in young children. The first one, start off with is night terrors. Not the night gallery with Rod Serling, but night terrors. Often in 4 to 8 year old kind of range. It happens about 2 hours after the child falls asleep. It's actually a partial arousal from deep non-REM sleep, and the child may be screaming in terror. I always compare it to The Exorcist with Linda Blair, when the head's going around, pea soup's coming out of her mouth. Everybody's totally freaking out.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of those things that even if you know what's going on, so for instance, one of my children had this experience, I think twice, and both times, even though I knew exactly what was going on, it's like watching a febrile seizure. You know what's going on, you know it's benign, but it still freaks you out.
And it happens in 1 to 3% of kids. That's a lot of kids. And there is family histories. Some families it's more common. And the next morning, the kid has no memory of the event at all. And the parents can have mild PTSD.
The parents are still
totally shaking from it. So we mentioned a little bit earlier, usually this just goes away. If it's happening night after night after night, the first thing I usually talk about is, and it's happening the same time, then wake them up 10 or 15 minutes before it's going to happen a couple nights in a row. And sometimes you can break the cycle.
Yep. Yeah, it's like resetting them.
Right. I've had a couple of parents who have used things like Benadryl for it. I don't recommend that routinely,
Yeah.
but I will say that some of them said it really worked well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, desperate parents, I've occasionally said, like, hey, listen, if you just need a parent mental break, evening or two, then, as much as we don't like to snow kids into sleep, Benadryl seems like a relatively safe option. As long as I always warn them about the paradoxic effect. You may
Kids
end up
go
with
nuts.
the Wolf Man or something like
I had
that.
a
That
child
evening.
that mom gave it when they're going on an airplane, a cross-country trip, and they had to actually turn around the tarmac and come back. The kids went nuts. So, if you're going to use it, test it out first, because you may be that small percentage of kids that just cannot handle Benadryl.
Aye.
Okay, nightmares. Also, usually a little bit older than 3 or 4 years of age. Nightmares occur in the second half of the night in REM sleep while you're dreaming. And they can have triggers like scary movies. It's not always a family history. This time, as opposed to night terrors, a child may have vivid memories of what occurs. And I remember the one nightmare of childhood I remember was a nightmare about a head rolling down the stairs that came from the movie Hush, Hush, Sweet Charlotte with Betty Davis that I watched on Channel 7 ABC 4:30 movies back in the 60s. So, nightmares, they're not worrisome, but they're common.
Yeah, I find that if you ask closely enough in terms of your questioning, more often than not, there does seem to be something, and particularly in this day and age when things are so ubiquitous that kids watch, there's something that a child watched that they probably shouldn't have been watching that has just stuck with them. And I got to say, I don't have really good answers for the parents when they ask me what to do about this. It's hard to unthink something. And so I will essentially tell them, hey, listen, be patient. This should burn itself out, be comforting. But aside from tincture of time, I don't have much to offer.
Except, again, just advising that they shouldn't be watching
Sure.
scary things. And compared to before, years ago, with the internet and with different apps, there's many more opportunities for kids to watch scary things, even if their parents don't realize it. I think we should mention one specific rare sleep issues with kids, which is nocturnal seizures. They're rare. They occur most often about 5 to 10 years of age and can include any or all of the following type things: incontinence or wetting, tongue biting, difficulty to arouse after because they're in a post-ictal state, which means being sleepy after a seizure. Sometimes you get the classic tonic-clonic where your arms are stiff and go back and forth like in usual seizure motions. If there's any question about this, then an EEG or a brainwave test is indicated to look for it. Lastly, there's the headbangers. For those about to rock! Again, you just blew out our mixer here. All right.
We salute you!
I'm sorry. So usually it's a normal phenomenon, and they're like little Metallica toddlers. They can beat their heads up to 80 times a minute. Again, this is usually normal. My big sister Susan had this as a kid, but sometimes this can be associated with emotional issues, and this may need to be looked at when extreme or long-lasting. You have any kids headbangers?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, no, of course. I think we all do. And I think that that's one of the reasons that one of the many things that parents will ask us about that they're really concerned is a sign of some type of a neurodevelopmental issue. Golly, my kid seems to bang his head against the side of the crib. I'm sure he has autism. And the matter of fact is, if no other indicators are there, then it's just simply a self-soothing process for them, and typically not anything that's going to injure them.
Doesn't look very soothing.
No.
So, as mentioned before, we probably have very little completely original thoughts, and I want to give kudos to the work of Dr. Judith Owens, a real pediatric sleep guru, professor of neurology out of Boston Children's, who was my keynote speaker at a conference a few years ago. Some of her ideas are infused in this, especially when we get to the teens. But anything that doesn't make sense that we say that is wrong is definitely our fault, not Dr. Owens. She's never wrong about sleep. So as we talked about how essential sleep is for kids and asking about it each visit, there are some formal questionnaires and developmental screens of sleep that you can use in your office. I have not found it to be helpful for me. I just like asking about sleep each time and actually have that in my EMR. But the one sleep screen that has been used the most is something called the acronym BEARS, BEARS, which I think is the best of the screens and actually was created by Dr. Owens and Dr. Dalzell a few years ago to give you a frame of thinking about sleep. So I'm going to mention this BEARS just to think about. So B stands for bedtime problems and include falling asleep, which again may point to behavior issues and anxiety. The E stands for excessive daytime sleepiness, tired children, unrefreshing sleep. The A is for awakening at night. The R is for regularity of sleep and duration, the time they go to bed, the time they get up, the difference between weekdays and weekends. And the S stands for sleep disordered breathing, like snoring, apnea, the kind of things more likely to get a sleep study that Matt mentioned earlier, or a polysomnography, or PSG, another word for sleep study. We'll even get those before things like thinking about getting your tonsils and adenoids out with snoring and obstructive sleep apnea.
Or not. Oftentimes we'll send somebody along to an ENT, and I think most of the general pediatricians out there can speak to this experience, convinced that this kid's tonsils are purely obstructive. I mean, we have a very difficult time seeing the horizon beyond those big honking tonsils in there, and depending on the ENT, some will say, sure, this is something that we need to address surgically, within the next month or so, and others will suggest a sleep study. And I'm not sure how they differentiate those.
It's
things.
really interesting, and I think the academic way and pulmonology gets involved is to get a sleep study first. And I don't disagree with that in many of the cases. But sometimes you get that child, again, with those huge honking tonsils and that we can see. You can get a lateral x-ray, a soft tissue x-ray, and see the adenoids also. But you can see these huge tonsils. They bring in a video of the child with obvious apneic episodes during the night. The mother had her tonsils out for similar things the sibling had. Yeah. And most of those times, it doesn't take a lot of expensive sleep studies. I don't know about you, but I actually kind of know which ENTs, if it's an obvious case, will be more likely to go ahead and just schedule it as opposed to going maybe more by the book and getting a sleep study. Sure.
Yeah, I think those of us who have relationships with families and know a family situation, have seen this child's tonsils sometimes for years on end and documented tonsillar hypertrophy, really sometimes just want them out. And we'll say, okay, we want you to call and ask for this doctor. No, that doctor is the only one we want you to see. And that's really because we know that the job will be done. We're not trying to act like surgeons, but we're on the front lines with this. And oftentimes the surgeon's interaction with the parents is, 5 or 10 minutes.
And, I will say, and Dr. Owens made a great point of this, that a lot of times after they get the tonsils and adenoids out, you're like, okay, problem solved, it's over. But she makes a very good point that sometimes it doesn't solve the problem and that you have to really be vigilant. And probably we need to do some sleep studies after it's done to see if it really worked.
Interesting.
And especially when the kids, you get a history, if you keep asking that they're not actually doing that well.
Right.
Another interesting thing over the years is that they've changed how they take the tonsils out. Instead of just pulling them out, they will use these kind of rotary sucker things and go in there and take them out. Sometimes they grow back.
Yeah.
And that freaks out the parents. Like, wait a minute, we had this procedure, we had general anesthesia, and now they've grown back. And I think that may be a little bit more common when they leave the capsule in, but I think they're getting better and better with those techniques, so I don't see it very much.
Right. And when we cover some ENT topics as time goes on with these podcasts, I'm sure we'll get a little bit deeper into the weeds with these. Yeah, it can be a real game changer for a lot of kids who have sleep apnea. I've seen kids who suddenly were no longer exhausted all the time and really got a much more restful sleep, and it really became a game changer for an entire family.
Okay, that's it for sleep in this episode 2. We'll be back with episode 3 where we'll finish sleep, talking about teen sleep. We'll be right back for a few closing words about Mary Tyler Moore. Who can turn the world on with her smile? Who can take a nothing day and suddenly make it all seem worthwhile? Well, it's you, girl, and you should know it. With each glance and every little movement, you show it. Love is all around, don't need to waste it. You can have the town, why don't you take it? You're gonna make it after all. All right, we'll stop torturing you. I just want to say that I did that by heart. Matt had to look up the lyrics a little
Just
bit.
one line.
We were just talking today about how much we loved Mary Tyler Moore, and just wanted to salute her and salute Laura Petrie, salute Mary Richards.
Yeah. Oh,
and
boy. Just so entertaining, so wholesome. What a wonderful foil for Dick Van Dyke. You know, she was one of the very first, if not the first, woman who was given really respect on a sitcom for being more than just the cliche wife.
Yes, and it was 1961, and also the capri pants. She
Big in the capri
wore
pants.
pants where everybody else, Leave It to Beaver, they had to wear dresses. They had a vacuum wearing dresses. And I'm reading about it. She got a lot of brushback about that for the first few episodes.
Modern woman. Yeah,
And
yeah, it's funny. Somebody who seemed to have such a delightful persona really was a trailblazer.
She really was. And she got type 1 diabetes very early in her career. So, and back then, this is in the late 50s, early 60s. I mean, it was a lot harder to manage than now. A lot less choices in terms of insulin and ups and downs of sugar, which just makes it that much more incredible about her career.
Yeah. Did you know that she started a career as the dancing elf for one of the appliance companies?
I didn't know that, but I knew she was a dancer because there's some great episodes. Go on YouTube. Great episodes on Dick Van Dyke of her doing a little song and dance, which was great. And so I don't know about you, but the early mid 70s, Saturday nights, I guess I was in junior high school, not a great social life. So my Saturday nights was All in the Family, Mary Tyler Moore, Bob Newhart, and then the Carol Burnett show. I think MASH was a couple years in there, but I just was in heaven every Saturday night watching those shows.
Wow. No, just to get back to the elf for a second, I heard her interviewed by Terry Gross the other day in a rebroadcast and on NPR, and she was the happy hot point dancing elf. And so she would they would superimpose her on various appliances and kind of a mini Mary Tyler Moore. And it was apparently a very successful ad campaign. But once she got married and became pregnant, I believe within the first year or two of her marriage, the dancing elf wasn't quite so svelte anymore. And so they apparently tried to cover it up by having her like be in the washer and just look over the edge, that type of thing. But eventually that just kind of petered out. But I thought that was an interesting start to really just such a fabulous and iconic career.
And I have to mention my favorite episode, probably most of any TV series, but certainly of Mary Tyler Moore, was the Chuckles the Clown episode, where everyone else was making fun of Chuckles the Clown, and she was really upset. And then you just have to watch the funeral ceremony. And the singular line that I can always remember from that show is Chuckles the Clown saying, "A little song, a little dance, a little seltzer down your pants."
Have you tried that?
And also, you have to say, a lot of these tributes to her doesn't mention about her role in Ordinary People. I mean, it was such a great movie, but she played such a hateful mother, and
really against character.
Unbelievable acting, and I think that made the movie even more, because you're seeing Mary Tyler Moore, you're expecting this loving mother, and she was so good in that. She had such great acting chops, not just comedic acting chops. So
a great talent, really, who gave us a tremendous amount of enjoyment through her career.
So, Mary, wherever you are, I hope you're smiling, you're taking your hat off, and you're throwing it up in the air. And I think millions thank you for bringing joy to their lives.
Indeed.
Have a good day. Bye. Podcast Pediatricians Productions. All rights reserved.